Welcome back to the Bible in Context, where context is king and the original author's intent drives our interpretation. And we're still in our Canon series. We're going to talk about the writings this time. It's actually just going to be me. I want to talk about some of the data points surrounding the books of the writings, and then me and Nate will come back next time and discuss those a little bit more. But I'm going to lay out the data that we have for this collection of books. So where we've been so far, we've talked about the authorship of the Torah and the prophets and the Psalms, and how there is literary unity between those groups of books, and how we don't really know a whole lot about who was inspired to write these books, but they give us the tradition of God's intent with humanity, his intent with Israel, the covenant he made with them, his plan to redeem humanity, and the reasons why we're in the state we're in. It also gives us the tradition of the greatest prophet that Israel had until Jesus, being Moses, and then the continuation of that tradition in the prophets and Psalms. And really that tradition is where the Torah and then the subsequent prophets and Psalms derive their authority, and then all the more so for us as Christians, because this is the collection that Jesus saw himself as fulfilling and continuing the story that was within it. So again, go listen to our previous episodes for more on that. That's just a brief summary of where we've been. And this time we're going to jump into the writings. And just before we get going here, a few sources that you can use to dive deeper into this, because we can't go into everything about the writings because there's really a lot of discussion surrounding the writings. And part of that is because of how little information we have about the writings. There's not as much unity between the books as can be seen with the Torah, prophets, and Psalms. The literary data just isn't there. And so these books were selected, or not selected, but accepted into the group of authoritative writings by the Jewish community individually, it seems so, rather than having a broad corpus of literature that was then crafted to be part of the authoritative literature of the people of God. So some of those sources, I would recommend the Canon debate, the one that is edited by Lee McDonald and James Sanders. A lot of varying viewpoints that cover a lot of the topics that we're going to be covering in this podcast, and will give you some really good footnotes to dive even deeper into all this discussion if you want to. Another really great resource, Lee McDonald's work. He's got a 2-volume set called The Formation of the Biblical Canon. Highly recommend that. He's got other works on the canon as well, some that are more geared towards laymen, or at least shorter books. If you don't want to read a couple 1,000-page books, go check out some of his other works. And as always, I like to recommend, if you just want a simple, broad overview, Scribes and Scriptures by Mead and Gallagher. So all great resources. If you want to dive deeper, definitely check out those resources by McDonald and Sanders. And we'll just go ahead and dive into some of the high-level points you need to consider when we're talking about the recognition of the authority of the writings. So I've been saying the writings, and that's in the context of the Torah, prophets, and writings, the tripartite division, that 3-part division of the Hebrew Bible. And again, you can look that up, or just look at any table of contents in a Jewish Bible, and you'll see that 3-part grouping of the books of the Old Testament. Which is, again, different than most of our Protestant Old Testament groupings. But there's some complication with referring to the books that are in the writings when we're talking about the formation of the canon, or the formation of the books that are accepted as authoritative in the early church and in the early Jewish community. And the problem is, we don't really know if there was strictly a group of writings called the writings at this period. We know, based on the literary structures that we've talked about already, that we did have the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms, but it's possible that the rest of the books didn't get lumped into their own category as the writings, but were rather just this group of other texts that we have out here that we accept as authoritative along with the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, or some of them were just lumped in with the prophets as well. And really we see that before the first century, whenever we have references in books like the Gospel of Luke, where we have a reference to the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms, or the law and the prophets and the Psalms, or we see another reference to just the law and the prophets as referring to the whole Bible. We also have in the prologue to the Wisdom of Ben Sira, we have the law, the prophets, and the other writings referenced, and that was in the 2nd century BC. We have in Qumran, we have 4Q MMT mentions the writings of Moses, the prophets, and David. So again, that may be that Torah, prophets, and Psalms division, but it doesn't really include the writings. So again, maybe those were just kind of out there as some separate texts that they recognized as authoritative, or it could be as well that they were lumped into the prophets. We don't really know. And we know that Qumran had a few other texts that they did accept as authoritative, such as it seems like they had high regard for Jubilees and Enoch, the Temple Scroll, but it's hard necessarily to decipher what they held as authoritative and not in terms of orthodox views of canonicity. And again, we have Philo, and he is a biblical thinker and commentator from between the first centuries BCE and CE, and he groups the books as the law, the prophets, hymns, and other books. And so he may see this kind of four-part segregation of the books where we have, again, the Torah, the prophets, the hymns, which may be the Psalms, and then the other books. So again, these kind of just other texts out here. And then also in 4 Maccabees, and this was written around 50 CE, it just lumps all of the books of the writings into the prophets. So again, just before the 1st century CE, we have these blurred lines around the prophets and the writings. Was there a clear grouping between them? Or again, were the lines blurred? Were the writings just kind of out there, somewhat separate from the Torah, prophets, and Psalms, or were they lumped into it? And if they were lumped together, at what point did they become separated into the writings? And is that okay for us to view them as separate today? Well, something before we, again, dive into what the boundaries of the writings were and which books were in and out of the writings, it may be helpful to talk about some of the early canon lists that we have, some of the lists of books that were accepted as authoritative from the early Christian and Jewish communities, again, in and before the 1st century CE. That will give us a better insight into what did the earliest followers of Jesus and the people who were in Judaism right before Jesus, what were they accepting as authoritative? And it's fairly consistent as we go through this. So I'll start here with Josephus, and this is in the 1st century CE. He mentions 22 books that are authoritative, though he doesn't list them all. So we just know that he mentions 22 books that he kind of has in his Bible. Now, 22, if you went into your contents of your Bible and started counting, you'll notice that there are a few more than 22. So how did Josephus get to 22, and why is it that a lot of scholars actually see that 22 as consisting of, our Old Testament as we have it, essentially, as Protestants and Catholics with the first part of their Old Testament agree upon? And really this comes from the fact that some of our books that we look at in our Bibles are combined to early readers of their Hebrew Bibles. The 12 prophets, the 12 minor prophets, are just known as the Book of the 12 very often. You also can combine, or we have seen combined, the Book of Judges and Ruth, Jeremiah and Lamentations, Ezra, Nehemiah, and then all of those 1st and 2nds in your Old Testament, 1st and 2nd Samuel, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Kings, all those get pushed into one book instead of 2 each. So typically, the Old Testament is considered to be 24 books by early readers or early theologians. Josephus, he gets down to 22, possibly because he combined, Ruth and Judges or Jeremiah, Lamentations, something like that. Or maybe he omitted 2 books. But still, he's pretty close at least. And it may be that what he considers to be authoritative is the same as what we hold in our Old Testaments today. Now, we also see in the Gospel of Thomas, and we've had a whole couple episodes about the Gospel of Thomas on this podcast, around like episode 35, I think. So go check that out if you want to. But he mentions 24 prophets, referring to the Old Testament books, which is, again, that's on par with what we see, or what we would expect for someone in this period who held the same Old Testament that we do today, essentially. In 4 Ezra, this is around 100 CE. In chapter 14, verse 45, he mentions 24 books for the public, and then 70 for the wise. And so in this, he is referring to, again, this 24-book core of the Old Testament, and these 70 books for the wise may be things that are more good texts that should be read for those who already understand their scriptures well and kind of spit out the bones kind of thing. Maybe today, like, there's some really good books by some good pastors that need to be read by Christians who have a good understanding of the faith already. That kind of thing. But the point from 4 Ezra is the fact that there are 24 books, again, that are considered the core of the Old Testament. Again, there's another text, Baba Batra 14. This is from the Babylonian Talmud, and it lists basically the same books that we have in our Hebrew Bible in the 2nd century CE. It's not entirely in order, in the same order that we have our Old Testaments in, or in the same order that the traditional Hebrew Bible is in, but still, despite some small order differences, it agrees with the traditional Hebrew Bible that we are familiar with if you go crack open a VHS or something like that. Which, by the way, if you don't know what that is, that's the current standard scholarly Hebrew Bible, text critical edition that most seminary students will be reading out of. Now, this text, Baba Batra, is interesting because it's the first canon list that we have, and the others that we've mentioned have just been numbers of books, and it does include Esther, Song of Solomon, and Ecclesiastes. Now, why do I bring that up? Because there were some rabbis shortly around this period who were debating those 3 books. The status of the authority of those books were in question by some back in this time. But it's interesting that this early canon list does include those books, and it does seem still that the larger Jewish community and even rabbinical community would have accepted these books. So even though there was some contention around this time, surrounding whether or not these books should be in the canon, and again, this was first century, so this was around the time of Jesus, it seems like by and large they were accepted as authoritative within the Jewish community. But it is just interesting to see and to note that some of these debates were still going on, and that there wasn't this fixed, closed, list of books or fixed binded codex that they had back then, that it was like, this is the Bible. It was still, some of this was still forming. There was room to disagree over which books were authoritative and which were not, at least outside of the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms. And again, we're going to talk more about the blurring of those boundaries in just a second, because yes, there are blurred boundaries in the terms of, are these writings their own distinct group, or are they blurred with the prophets? And also, there's some fuzzy edges around the boundaries, especially with the 3 books of Song of Solomon, Esther, and Ecclesiastes. Is there room to question the boundaries of the writings? Again, we'll talk about that in just a second. Also, one more list I want to bring up, and that's the Brynjolf's canon list from the early 2nd century. And again, it divides the books a little bit differently, but it's roughly equivalent to our modern Old Testament, or Hebrew Bible. Now, if the writings was not a distinct group back in this time, but there were some other texts out there separate from the Torah, the prophets, and the writings, which were considered authoritative by the Jewish community, then we have to ask the question, since this gets raised even today, what about books like those found in the Apocrypha? Ones that the church seems to have, in large swaths, not considered to be authoritative, but have still been respected by many and considered authoritative by some. Should those have been put into the writings? Did early Jews put them into the writings? How should we think about that? And what are our guidelines for deciding whether or not something should be considered authoritative? Again, I'm kind of stepping away from the word canonical, because the canon, again, there was no great point of like, the canon is closed now. There was no canonization point. Rather, it's more so a process of figuring out and deciding which books are authoritative, and especially for some of these books that are on the fringes, I guess, within this debate, the measuring stick is it in line with the tradition of the Torah and the prophets that we had discussed at the beginning of this episode? Now, and even saying that, I just need to say that is not an ancient criteria. That is one I think that is reasonable for us to consider. But actually, Jews were thinking a little bit differently about how the canon closed back in the time before and around Jesus, for instance. Some Jews thought that the Spirit had left around the time of the return to Israel out of Persia. Really, the case for the Spirit having left Israel around that time, there isn't really a good case to be made for it scripturally. And really, we have the New Testament being written after that period. Yes, that's after the return of Jesus, so you can make an argument for that. But there just doesn't seem to be any special case to say that the Spirit had left Israel at this point, especially, no more than whenever God had brought the exile about, when he actually did leave per Ezekiel. So all that to say, there's just really not any strong evidence to suggest that the canon stopped expanding because the Spirit left Israel. And again, MacDonald has some really good comments and thoughts on that idea. Also, they considered that a book could not be canonical if it hadn't been written in Hebrew as well. So that might be why, the book of Daniel, for instance, has Hebrew on either side of the book as well, even though the middle of it is written in Aramaic. But all that to say, there really was never any great closing event that solidified the Old Testament. Even up until the day of Jesus, there was still debate about some of the boundaries of the writings. A lot of them were very accepted. They were still part of the core authoritative writings of the Hebrew Bible. But again, it wasn't as black and white as we would like it to be. So we have to have some of this conversation. So one thing that Old Testament scholars will often look at, and rightfully so, to try and decide a book's value and authority within the Jewish community, and within the first century and before, is to look at the way that certain books were used in different Jewish communities around the first century and before, or a little bit after as well. And so one place they can look for that is the Qumran community, where we get the Dead Sea Scrolls. And there they often will write these pesher, these commentaries on books they find to be authoritative. But again, they also have some pesher that are on books that don't seem to be from the Torah, prophets, or Psalms, or other writings. So they have some outliers out there that they have written commentaries on. So it's, again, not exactly black and white. They also, again, like I said, held some books to be authoritative that other Jews may not have recognized, it seems. So it's also hard to judge this sectarian community. That has to be kept in mind. They weren't mainstream Judaism. They were a sect that had broken off from the larger group of Judaism. So in some ways, the Qumran community is not the best test case, even though it is helpful to look at it. Now, I think especially for Christians, it's important to take a look at the way the New Testament will use the books of the Old Testament in order to show definite authority in certain books. Now, quotation of Old Testament books isn't exactly a clear-cut test for whether or not a book has authority, because there are books that are cited that are not considered to be authoritative, such as, Paul quoting different Greek poets rather than the Old Testament. He's doing that because he's in a certain context where that makes sense for him to make a point to his audience by using their culture. And so there are some places where you could say, yes, the way they're quoting the Old Testament here, it's not proving the authority of the Old Testament, but rather they're making a good point based off this text that the Jewish audience already knows. There are other places where it's very clear that Jesus and the apostles are using the Old Testament in order to ground Jesus's identity, mission, everything about him. They're grounding his identity in the Old Testament, in these certain books. And again, that's why we as Christians value the Old Testament. It should go to the Old Testament. Once we become Christians and have a basic understanding of Jesus, we should be plugging into our Old Testaments to understand more about who he is and who the apostles saw him as. So, what books did the New Testament quote? Now, this is from the Nestle-Aland. I haven't gone through and looked through the entire, commentary on the New Testament use of the Old, because I'm sure there may be a few more things in there that could be proved compared to what Nestle-Aland may see. Maybe not. But the Nestle-Aland list out that the New Testament uses all the books of the Old Testament except for, this is a fairly long list, but Joshua, Judges, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, 2nd Kings, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Ecclesiastes, Song of Solomon, Lamentations, Obadiah, Nahum, Zephaniah, and possibly Ezekiel. Now, that sounds like quite a lot, but we've already talked about Joshua and Judges as well as 2nd Kings. Those are all part of that large story from Genesis to 2nd Kings, part of the Torah and Prophets, and so those are all one literary corpus that need to be taken together. Also with Obadiah, Nahum, and Zephaniah, they're part of the Book of the 12, so those are also part of the authoritative group of texts. And as for the rest, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, Esther, Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Lamentations, those are all part of the writings in that group of books that is a little bit fuzzy. However, Ruth, 1st and 2nd Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, and Lamentations, there was really no debate about those. Those were accepted in the authoritative books that were listed out in the early church and early Jewish community. There's really no debate around them. Again, in 90 CE, there was this Jewish council called the Council of Jamnia, where there was some question over Ecclesiastes, Song of Songs, and Esther, but by and large, they were accepted as well. So just because they weren't in the New Testament doesn't mean they're not authoritative. But I just wanted to point out that there's only a handful of books, let's see, with Ruth, the books of Chronicles, Ezra, Nehemiah, which are typically grouped as one book, and then the other three that are debated plus Lamentations. That's 7 books without any New Testament quote that aren't part of some larger corpus of accepted writings. But even still, the Jewish community and the Christian community did accept them. And the apostles and Jesus didn't seem to take the time in the New Testament to want to list out all the books because that wasn't really a question they were wrestling with. And it seems maybe they didn't feel a need to have to wrestle with that question. And again, I think we're going to get into why a little bit here in just a minute. But before moving on from that, I just want to mention the fact that in Gallagher's introduction to the Septuagint, the translation of the 70 is the name of that book, he mentions that based on the New Testament and Dead Sea Scroll usage, and I'm going to throw in Philo there as well, that all the books in the Old Testament or the Hebrew Bible, the Tanakh, seem to be accepted as canonical by the 1st century CE. And Philo, interesting enough, he didn't really cite from any books that were outside of the Tanakh. So he may have had a very traditional boundary of what the Hebrew Bible was to him that would have agreed with our Hebrew Bible and the 24 book lists that we've mentioned earlier. Okay, so if there were some blurry edges around the books that we consider today to be the writings, what criteria should we be using to decide whether or not these books are authoritative? Again, many will lean back on Jewish tradition and church tradition, and I think that is a good first start. I think for the earliest, especially the earliest Jews who were familiar with this culture and these books and the tradition that was being handed down with them, for them to have accepted certain books should speak a lot towards that book, and for it not to be some sort of sectarian or partisan selection, but rather the community, the Jewish community as a whole, is on board with this certain set of books. I think that should be a good starting place for us to consider and accept these books as authoritative. However, I think there are additional criteria we need to look at, because we do, again, since there was no canon closing event ever in history, it is still valid for those who want to ask the question, should certain books be in our canon and not? I think that question isn't really a valid question for the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms. On the writings, I don't really have a reason to doubt what's in our writings, but there are those who want to raise those questions, and I think they're decent questions. We need to address them. So what criteria should we use to evaluate what the boundaries of the writings are? Should certain books be out? Should we accept books like Enoch or the Apocrypha, Jubilees, or any other book like that? How should we weigh that? Well, again, with there being no canon closing event, nothing coming down out of heaven saying, these are the books, I think it would be responsible for us to admit that we don't have a set list outside of the Torah, prophets, and the Psalms. What authority did the Jewish community have to select books that we don't have, or to reject books that we today don't have? And after all, these debates over the Deuterocanon, over the apocryphal books, that's still going on today. And then there's, again, others out there who are arguing for other books from the Jewish pseudepigrapha or later Gnostic texts, things like that, to be included in the canon. And so in speaking about the Old Testament, I'm going to limit this conversation to, say, the Apocrypha, and perhaps you can consider the same thing when talking about some pseudepigraphal works. We'll throw First Enoch in there as well, even though I think it'd be better to address maybe in the New Testament portion since he's cited in Jude. But again, what authority did the early Jewish community have to select and reject certain books? After all, it does seem apparent that in the translation of the 70, Gallagher's book on the New Testament, it seems apparent, he brings this up, that Paul and the other apostles, they were familiar with the Apocrypha. They read it. There were things in the New Testament that are very subtle allusions. They didn't quote it. They didn't seem to treat it like it was like scripture, but they read it and apparently found it valuable enough to even share some of the same thoughts that they were having in the Apocrypha. And that also doesn't decide the question of whether or not it is authoritative. Now, the main criteria I think that we should be using to look at these books beyond the Torah, prophets, and the writings, which have the priority of authority, we should be evaluating books based on how much they align to the tradition of the Torah and the prophets and the Psalms, and which primarily is the Torah, because the prophets and the Psalms, they're just an outflow of the Torah. So keep that in mind. Now, I think the early Jewish community did a good job with the collection we have today as the writings in ferreting out which books were part of that tradition faithfully and those which were not, or those which, mostly were, but weren't quite good enough to be in the canon, but they're still good books to read, that kind of thing. And you see that even with, for Ezra, the mention of the books of the 70, the ones that were they were pretty good books, but they're not quite enough to be canonical, to be given to everybody to teach new truth, only for those who can read and spit out the bones. So ultimately, outside of the fact that, Jesus, he quotes some books to place his identity within them, such as Daniel. He finds that authoritative very clearly, things like that. The Torah should be the measuring stick of the other books of the Bible, throughout the Bible. If it doesn't align with the tradition found there, then it shouldn't be in the canon. If it does, then it's a good book to read. And so the prophets, the Psalms, and the writings, those books, those collections, they are continuing the tradition of Moses in different contexts, to different people, in different genres. And so, again, the Torah should be the measuring stick. And also, with that, you should keep in mind that there should be no new doctrine found outside of the Torah in these other books that we consider to be authoritative or within our canon. If you're finding new doctrine, if you're looking for new doctrine, then you just need to stop that enterprise right there, because the Torah is the source of everything else. And if you're finding something new somewhere else, then you're doing one of two things. You're either reading the wrong book, or you're reading the right book in the wrong way. You need to go back and look at the historical and the literary context, and maybe your interpretation is incorrect. But again, anything that you find beyond the Torah that does not align with the Torah is either a misreading or you're not reading the right text. And so with that, I would say, again, there's been a long line of tradition that has ferreted out what is in line with that tradition of Torah and of Moses and of God's intention with humanity and with Israel. And that has given us the Hebrew Bible that we now have, the Torah, the prophets, the Psalms, the writings, and those are good books. And I think that we should read them. I think we should hold them as authoritative. I think that we should take them, especially in the writings, I think we should take them not as authoritative in and of themselves, but authoritative in as far as they relay and express the tradition of the Torah in new contexts and genres and so on, which I think they do faithfully, so we can take them at their word. We don't have to sit there and scrutinize them. So read the writings, see how they take the truths of the Torah and show them to you in new ways. And again, as Christians, as we're just reading day to day, that will show us in new lights the way we live more faithfully to Christ. I think it's helpful to have those other stories, other genres, other time periods to see faithfulness to God so that we can better understand what is at the core of the message of the Bible. Now, as for the Apocrypha, as for Enoch, these other books that are kind of debated, but have been traditionally held as outside of the canon by the early Jewish community, most of the early Christian community, and most today, even though there's a large divide on the Apocrypha between Catholics and Protestants and some other traditions as well. I say, if you have the time, and I would say again, just practically, if you have very little time to read, because a lot of us do have very little time to read, stick with the main books. But if you want to read those books, go for it. I say read them. They were respected by much of the Jewish community. They weren't held as authoritative. They seemed to see something that was a little bit out of line. So perhaps that was part of the 70 books that 4 Ezra talks about, that's for only those who are wise and already know the scriptural tradition, because maybe these are books that are helpful and can be helpful to some, but they should be, again, taken back to Torah and measured against Torah, because there's some things in them that are not quite right. So I say go for it if you want to, read those books, but hold them against the Torah and only take from them what you already see in the Torah. If you're seeing any new doctrine, if you're seeing anything anything that's just not already found in the Torah, then don't pay attention to it. That is ultimately, I think, the tack that we should take when coming to the writings and the Apocrypha and these other books. The writings are well accepted and well vetted through the believing community, the early believing community, as to align with this tradition. And these other books, they're good books. They were respected, not held as authoritative. So by all means, read them, learn from them. If you see anything that's out of line with the Torah, then don't pay attention to that, because that's why it's not held as authoritative fully by the early community. And again, I feel the need to make one more caution here. Just, again, if you're going to go out and read these books and try to hold them on your own against Torah and interpret them on your own, just exercise some good diligence in your interpretation. Consult multiple commentaries, consult multiple traditions, do really good exegesis that pays attention to the literary structures in that passage surrounding it, within that book, within that literary corpus. What is the historical environment in which this book is being written within and to? Pay attention to all those things very carefully. And if you don't know for sure, just throw your hands up and say, I'm not sure, and be honest about that, because the reason I'm throwing this caution out is because there are enough people who want to see certain things in a text. They will go and find it, and then go and, they'll find it in one of these, just say one of these fringe books, and then go and interpret what they think they found or they want to find into the other canonical books. That's just going to happen. People are people, but I just want to throw some caution against that. Just for instance, in 2 Maccabees, that is a book often used to prop up prayer for the dead or baptism for the dead. Then there's other passages that are used within the accepted, I'll just say the Protestant canon, to prop up that idea. But again, if you're finding something new in one of these fringe books and then coming back to the canon to find it elsewhere, that's the wrong way to do it. You should be doing it the reverse. So just had to throw that caution out. All right. Next week, me and Nate will come back and we'll talk about this a little more. I'm sure I didn't cover everything, but I just wanted to give some of the main data points and ultimately just point us back to the fact that the authority that we are looking for in these books is all derived from the message given in the Torah, the prophets, and the Psalms by the scribes that gave us that tradition of God and his intention with humanity, his intention with Israel, with the premier prophet they had up until the time of Jesus being Moses, and how that tradition played out through the course of Israel's kingdom and exile and so on. So I hope that was helpful, and despite some of the loosening of the boundaries of the canon that I think I may have done in this episode, I hope at the same time you feel more solidified in your trust of the canon and what we have, because it is an extension of the Torah, not just some random book that some Jews between 3 and 2,000 years ago decided, we like these, we're going to put these in the canon. That's often how I've heard this talked about, is like, well, since this old community liked it so much, then we have to accept it, but we have no real reason to tell you why they had authority to choose this. But rather, I think there's a better reason for why they chose it, even though they in of themselves were not the people that God said, hey, you guys decide who the canon is. That's just not something that we see in scripture or in history. So again, I hope as seeing the Torah as the anchor of the scripture is something that gives you more confidence as you read your scripture and the confidence to go and read other books. But if you are someone who knows your Bible well and has been in it for a while, have the confidence to properly understand them and read them as good pastoral books that may lend some benefit to you or others you may talk to them about with. So until me and Nate get back together and talk about this next week, happy reading.